Ich begrüße Sie hier sehr herzlich. Das ist heute für heute unsere letzte Runde im Art Cologne Talk Programm, wo wir Themen, von denen wir meinen, dass sie gerade sehr dringend oben auf der Agenda stehen, verhandeln. Und heute haben wir hier eben zum Anlass das Queer Budapest, eine Galerie, die sich speziell um queere Gruppen in Budapest und deren Rechte stark macht, der Special Guest der Art Cologne ist, und da lag es natürlich sehr nahe zu sagen, dass ihr auch hier auf unserer Talkbühne ein Forum haben sollt. Und drumherum haben wir weitere Gäste eingeladen, aber das wird unser Moderator Haris Giannouras gleich erklären. Und überhaupt, wir switchen jetzt in Englisch, und ich hoffe, das ist okay für Sie. Wir haben ja auch sehr viele Gäste im Online-Streaming über unsere Webseite, die begrüßen wir hier auch an dieser Stelle, und damit würde ich sagen, geht's jetzt los. Vielen Dank schon mal.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's very wonderful to be able to do this again. The talks at Art Cologne used to be a big tradition, and it's nice that once again we're able to do this in real life and on the streaming. My name is Giannouras. I am the assistant curator at Museum Abteiberg in Mönchengladbach, and the panel today deals with the questions of queer erasure, resisting erasure, and as we briefly talked about visibility, it's based on the question of what happens with visibly queer artists working, particularly in the political context of Hungary, on the occasion of Queer Budapest working and showing their work and activating their work in performances here at the Art Cologne, and also particularly in Europe, in Germany specific and in general in Europe. Perhaps before we start, I can just briefly introduce you guys. Claus Richter is an artist based in Cologne. He recently opened his solo show at Klages Gallery in Cologne, and I think last month you revealed a contribution to a public monument you created in the city of Düsseldorf dedicated to queer visibility and diverse gender expressions. Next to Claus is Guarnieri. She is the director of the newly newly opened department of Sotheby here in Cologne. She has many years of experience working in auction houses in Germany and in Switzerland, with a particular focus in contemporary art, and you're also addressing questions of online and outreach as it relates to questions of the art market, which I think it's a very important thing to think about if we talk about queer art. And of course, Thomas Rowan and Susanna Turo, who are the founding members of Queer Budapest. You guys are going to say, of course, way more about the initiative, but just briefly, Queer Budapest is a platform, an initiative, and an organization, if I may say, that was founded in 2020, addressing questions of queer diaspora and organizing different kind of forms and formats with lots of different artists who are a special guest this year's Art Cologne. Perhaps since the panel is titled after your contribution to the fair, I could just start with a very basic question. How did you guys first decide to come together? It's a quite known difficult political situation in Hungary and in many different European countries of the East since many years that creates a very hostile environment for queer people. But was there a specific occasion where you thought it's time for us as young people working in the arts to come together and to work on this? What was the occasion? Please.
Thank you for the question. Well, we used to work and study together with Thomas back in London, and I approached him with the idea to establish something like a platform or a network to support and to articulate this kind of artistic scene, which is not being articulated precisely back in Hungary, but as well as towards abroad. So I approached him back in 2020 during the summer if he wanted to do such a platform with me, like Queer Budapest, to support queer art, queer artists, and precisely under these circumstances I felt, as a Hungarian, I felt extremely important to raise awareness on this issue that we are having.
Do you want to say something?
Clearly I said yes. So Yeah, so Gianna brought me the project, and I was looking to do something at the time, particularly with emerging artists and trying to establish something, especially somewhere where, say, in Budapest, it's not, the queer scene isn't as well connected, I would say. So it's been an interesting journey with Shoshana. So.
And are the actions and the forms that this activity takes, either a performance or an exhibition, taking place and are organized solely in Budapest, or are you also working abroad in Europe? Is the showing you're doing here at the fair the first time you're showing, let's say, in Germany?
Yeah, it's the second show we've done here at Art Cologne. The first one was in November 2020, and it was it was shown in a artist collective sports group in like an island in North Budapest, and then that kind of was the first action we did, and then it kind of grew from there.
I think it's quite interesting because we briefly discussed today what it means to be visibly queer and how that relates to you occupying a certain public space. Claus, when you finally decided to work on such a big thing, because it has to be very, I don't know, scary to say that you are the one who articulates how a monument takes its form and what that means. How did you decide on the form, and what were your thoughts behind your process of saying, this is the monument that I would like to contribute?
It was, of course, terrifying because you're a single person and it's about a lot of other people, including yourself. I'm also gay, so I was part of the group, but it was by chance because it was a competition. A lot of artists were invited, and some of them gay and some of them not gay, or trans or bi or whatever. So it was an anonymous competition. I won it, and the first idea was we had a walk through the town of Düsseldorf, where the monument is now placed. And it was all about, of course, queer visibility, and it in the air was to do something very avant-garde, very kind of like modern, so something that maybe only works with sound or kind of a smell or so. So the expectations were towards a direction of kind of also abstraction and so on. We passed a lot of old monuments, these historic monuments, which are also a lot of discussions around them at the moment. And I liked them somehow. I thought they were kind of a thing that we are used to see this is a monument. I'm a very simple guy. For me, cheese is yellow and a square, a sausage is round and pink. So I'm really simple-minded. And I was like, a monument, why not do another kind of bronze, figurative monument? And of course, that was very against the whole thing that I normally also do, and that the things that were expected to happen. But yeah, one thing came to the other, and in the end we really have now in Düsseldorf, just around the corner, a monument which deals with the remembrance of lots of people who died in Düsseldorf during the Second World War, and of course also kind of an outlook towards the future and today for queer visibility. And it's a classical bronze monument on a stone pedestal. And
do you want to describe it a little bit? How did you choose the form?
I wanted it to be not abstract. I wanted not to hide kind of the things that happened behind a facade of abstraction. I wanted to be to have it figuratively, to see that it's about humans, it's about people. So why not have people? And so it really was very simple, and it took a long time to find. I wanted to include sort of all sexualities and all genders, which is totally impossible because there are millions. And I also said, of course, you can now start and say there's a gay sexuality, there's a lesbian sexuality, there's a trans sexuality, and trans is not a sexuality, but there's a bisexuality. But in all these kind of drawers, there are millions of sub things. If you're kind of whatever, if you're a flamboyant gay, or if you're like a butch leather, and so this is so different, and people are also not friendly to each other normally. It's not that we are all like this happy community. There's also lots of like subcultures who like don't like each other. So it would be totally naive to say like this is. But I wanted to include somehow a variety, and to find people that for me like could stand for this variety was the longest process.
I think that's I mean, a public monument is the most, first step of clearly showcasing what queer visibility means. But I think it's interesting to reflect on how that the power of representation jumps into the art market. Barbara, after your experience of working in very renowned auction houses and over the years, have you seen a shift? Is there a shift in terms of gender expressions and identities? Is it something that's important? If we look in the past, in the history of like the last 20 years, the white genie male artist, is he still selling better than a female artist? And is a female artist still a step ahead from a gender, more complicated gender expression?
Yes, thank you first for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here. And this is a very difficult question because it's a lot about you we're talking. So maybe I can just take one point after the other. We are very passionate and curious in everything we do. We are inspired by artists and by collectors who believe in the transformation of the power, who believe in the transformation power of art and culture. So we are very happy to support queer visibility and diversity. But if you look at the auctions and also at the museums and the exhibitions, there is queer visibility, but the focus is not on queer visibility. So it is represented, but not very, very strong. And this is over the last years growing, but there's a lot to do. And if you talk about female artists and female art in auctions, you know that in the last 6 years we have 70% of works from male artists in the auctions and only 25 or 26% of female art in the main topic. So. But in the real contemporary market, it's a little bit different. So there we have 58% of male artist work and 42% of female. So this is changing, but still there's a lot to do and a lot of work for everybody to just higher the visibility.
I think that's quite important also to reflect upon what that visibility means, because when I first read the title of the panel, Queer, it's such a vast, broad spectrum of expressions, gender expressions and artistic expressions. So if we were, for example, to compare a position that's more direct and visibly, and in a sense, and I'm using the word in a very positive sense, based on a propaganda, but a very positive sense of being honest and direct, is completely different to like a nuanced personal question. And with regards to the work you guys do and the artists you collaborate with, do you tend to see a difference between positions who are way more direct and they deal straight up with what we could call a very honest form of queer visibility, of what we're shoving to people's faces because we need to shove it to people's faces in order to for it to make sense, as opposed to positions, for example, where if there is a question of queerness, it ends up finding its way in the logic of the work in a nuanced way that might not be the easiest. It might not be the first thing you would think if you see a work. Do you see a difference between the two? Both of them are legit, both of them important. And how do you think they relate?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really interesting topic that you're talking about here. Is with Queer Budapest, we really want to emphasize the first one that you were mentioning, that we because of this lacking of being queer or being LGBTQ in the art scene in Hungary is not being articulated at all. This is why we chose to do this very direct and very much political, inherently political kind of articulation yeah.
If it's a little too loud for you guys, we can pause for a second. There is a security note from dear ART Cologne, but I think it's not that loud. Perhaps if we speak on the microphone a little louder, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. So we chose to do this very very straightforward and very into people's face. Whereas, but I'm also proud of this exhibition that we created here, because now we have, for example, Hollow. It's a group of 3 artists together, and they now collaborated with a textile designer. And what they chose to do, or they choose to do from time to time in their projects, which are mostly occupying public spaces within Budapest, is to be this nuanced kind of not very straightforward way of questioning identity of Hungarians, Eastern European societies. So it's, I think it's this kind of exhibition which we put together is a very good example of how we can collaborate with these kind of people, with these kind of different perspectives, but still put something together meaningfully.
I think that's quite important because if you think about it, over the history of art and politics throughout the 60s, the others always tend to utilize what's given to us as our otherness as a means to get back to any form of mainstream. There is a reason first generation feminist art in the 60s was blatantly so-called quote-unquote female. There is a reason art that deals with questions of HIV and AIDS made in the early late 80s and early 90s was blatantly so-called queer. Claus, you yourself as a queer person, if I may use the term, and an artist, do you find yourself specifically and consciously using that as something that you use in your work, or does it just sometimes ends up finding its way just because it's there?
Yeah, I never used it. I see myself as a human. I don't identify, especially through my sexuality. I had it easy, so that's a difference maybe. I grew up in a small town in Germany, which was still quite tolerant, so I always wanted to be an artist. I had the right friends, so I had less struggle and pressure, which makes it easier for me to say, okay, so it's about everything and this. So, but then again, I think the way of seeing the world is, of course, totally influenced by being gay and also by growing up in a small town in the 70s as a gay boy. Which makes a difference and definitely does, and still does it today. So even in Cologne, which is a very tolerant city, I sometimes don't feel too easy to hold hands with my boyfriend and so on and so on. So it's inside, it's in the head. And this makes you look at things differently. Of course, someone who doesn't have the situation doesn't need to have this view of situations. So this is where it comes in. And this is always in everything I do. So not only in art, but also in other choices and actions.
And in terms of, let's say, this question and duality of clearly, visibly, strictly politically engaged queer art, not specifically only queer, but in general of, let's say, so-called feminist art from the 60s, do you think that, Barbara, from the scope and the perspective of the art market, is there a place, and do this, let's say, for many people, direct and honest political works, do they work in an art market context? Would we see them coming up on an auction, or is it irrelevant? It only has to do with the artist, and that kind of a question isn't necessarily a pro or a con, with your experience.
As we are working mainly on the secondary market, we are not, we are not working really with the contemporary artists which are now working for galleries or for museum exhibitions. So looking on the secondary market, you mainly see famous artists who reach the secondary market. So their kind of works are always a little bit more calm and not so violent, I think, mainly. But nevertheless, you see queer artworks, very strong queer artworks on the art market. If you look for them. I don't think they just jump into your eyes like this, but you have to look for them. And they are there, and they are very good. They're good, and they are very strong, and they reach good prices.
I don't know, I keep thinking on that question of there is a space either in the art market, in the gallery scene, if you're a contemporary artist, or in the public space that queer art has to or occupies. I read there is a book published last year titled Queer Budapest, and that describes a very fascinating history that up until briefly from the last quarter of the 19th century, even until the 40s or the 60s, there was a very liberal and open society, specifically centered around Budapest with regards to gender expression and queerness. It's something that in many different historical occasions we know that. It's something that we know from Berlin at the time, and something that's well known in Paris. And it's interesting to see that how that differs from today. I found it quite interesting. Is it, first of all, is this era of, let's say, queer liberal expression that historically might be quite surprising for many people because it's so long ago? Is it known in general in history in Hungary, or in even queer people themselves? And how does it relate to what's happening today? For example, the fact that the mainly homosexual relationships at the time, of course, quite sexist, seen from a diverse scope of today's understanding that we have regarding gender and sexual orientation, but at the time mainly male-dominated sexuality. Is it something that people know about? Is it a known history or no?
Sorry.
Did you know?
I think it depends on how one chooses to see the country's history, because especially with the way that with the current government, they're definitely choosing a certain narrative for Hungary, that it is this white Christian nation that has a job to save Europe and protect the border, or there are more liberal-minded people, particularly around Budapest, that understand its history. But often that one finds with authoritarian governments is that, or anywhere, that often the queer undertone or the queer history often is excluded from the mainstream. So it's often the jobs of people like curators, artists, researchers to identify that history and introduce it into the narrative, because so yeah, I think it depends on how one chooses to see the country's past and its future.
And how does this past relate to what's happening today? For example, if we were to compare a sense of liberal queer expression in the dawn of the 20th century with queer visibility and how it's received from a mainstream heteronormative society today. Like the very basic example that Claus briefly mentioned, someone walking with their boyfriend down the street. How do you think that kind of signifies a difference?
Well, I would, instead of asking this question, I would rather emphasize the fact that nowadays we have a government which tries to oppress a certain community, certain communities, like several communities within society, and chooses to articulate a kind of narrative, this heteronormative Christian far-right kind of narrative, but whereas, but at the same time, we still have a very open society, which, like from the grassroots, is very, very supportive towards these kind of people, and it was just this summer that we could have, after the pandemic, we could have Budapest Pride, and it was an amazing experience. Like, we never had so many people on the streets just celebrating peacefully Pride. And this is something of a reminder that if we still have this kind of government nowadays, and for 10 years now, or 11, we still have a very open kind of society which doesn't reflect this kind of government.
How would you say, Claus, something like that relates to, let's say, for example, Cologne? today as opposed to like 20 years ago, occupying as a visibly queer person, occupying public space? How do you think it's I don't want to say that it's better or worse because it's a very more nuanced and complicated history and it's so much more personal, so it doesn't, it shouldn't be brought down to that kind of evaluation, but how do you think it differs from your personal experience?
I think it totally depends on the bubble you're in. So for me it changed a bit because I tried to avoid too narrow of bubbles, and like on the streets, I remember, like I lived in Frankfurt before, I remember also I got hit by guys for kissing someone, and so this happened. But I always thought, okay, these are assholes, and it was never, it didn't repeat itself. It was once like in 10 years, and it was a situation where there were a lot of people and party and blah. So what I really feel, because I have kind of a lot of schools around me where I live and so on, so you have younger people, and I have the impression that like it's more widely accepted somehow, or tolerated, maybe not accepted, but tolerated, and like also like in kind of social groups where it was once really stigmatized, it somehow is also cool to have a best gay friend or something like this. All these like things that you see on TV or in series or in shows kind of sivers through. So all these things are small things that happen which sort of make the situation better, but you see how fast it can change again. So even if you look to the United States, government-wise, you had like in the Obama administration, you even had a homepage that said things will get better, we are going in to see how we change the structures and so on. They were all instantly shut down when Trump arrived, which is kind of now a Western thing, and we're talking about the East. But I think you can see how fast it can change. So for me, it's, I think also in the harshest, as you also say, in the harshest of cold wind that blows, you always have sort of a group of people who are open and who will live to live and to be together. So I think this is like, even under the most difficult situations possible, but it's difficult. So, and I think here it's a bit more easy.
I think the word bubble is important because it shows the problematic of addressing those issues and those questions, because you tend to think in a very normative way. And that's way more nuanced and complicated to asking the question, what's happening in that particular context? Because a context is usually way more nuanced and complicated, and it's never just the one thing. But I have the feeling that the more we keep talking about that sense of visibility and honesty and being public, you stumble across the role of institutions. That might be a museum, that might be the art market. And do you think, for example, that an auction house, first of all, is it even possible, the way I'm not familiar with the system, the way that a sale is brought together, the way that decision is being made, what work is of particular importance and relevance to be shown in a specific moment? Do you think at that point, those questions of identity relating to gender expressions, is it something that, is it consciously important, or perhaps just as a general feel? I mean, I've read the team you're leading is almost 100% a female team at the Sotheby in Cologne. Do you consciously reflect on that kind of, like, let's say, mentality as you work, as works come in your hands, as you put together a sale, as the machine moves, let's say?
Yes, really interesting question. Thank you. Yes, there are 2 points I would like to answer. One, we are indeed a very female team in Cologne working together, but also we do have 3 male colleagues, so it's not only female group. And yes, when we work together, identity matters, sure. It's always important. But nevertheless, we don't think always about this, because if we put a sale together, we depend a little bit on our clients, because it's not always that we say, oh, today we would love to have a work from you in our sale and on the secondary market, and we have a client who is giving it to us. We just depend on the clients who decide what they want to sell and in which moment they want to sell. We surely can support them and say, perhaps now it's a good moment to sell your work, but they have to decide. In the end, we do curate the sales, and we always try to put them together to make them really interesting. And the sale is interesting if the whole works, or the whole spectrum of the works is very diverse and very different from one to the other. So surely we do have topics of sales. So we had female artist sales, and the first female artist sale we did in 2019 in New York was a huge success. And we did the second sale in London this year in May, and it was also a very big success. And we do contemporary African art sales. So in all these sales we do have queer visibility art. So it's not that we do one sale of queer visibility, but there are always artists and artworks which are related to queer visibility. So I think it is present in the sales at the moment.
Do you think there is a difference comparing how the auction house system has evolved with a key reference point online sales as opposed to real life as it relates to those kind of works? Would you say that perhaps these are perhaps works that could be addressed to a more global and a different audience using an online platform as opposed to a real life, or it's not necessarily of importance?
I can understand your question, but due to the development of auction houses, we are online with every sale for about 10 years now. So every sale is seen worldwide. Not the auction, not only the auction can be live or online too, but the viewing of the works are online and you can see everything. So the worldwide visibility of sales is given. So if you are looking for something, you can find it on the home pages of each auction house. But we do online sales which are only online, and we do sales which are live sales, and you can also bid online. So this is the two possibilities we have to buy. But all works are visible on the home pages everywhere. So you can find them if you are looking for works.
And I mean, it's a little bit of a repetition, but I think it's important that form of visibility is talked about. Do you guys think that in the work you do with Queer Budapest, is there a big difference between the collaborations you guys do with artists that are based and working in Hungary as they relate to questions of gender expression and queerness, as opposed to people who belong to a global diaspora? You're both have been based in, you Thomas, you are based in London, so that means that allows for, let's say, if I may use the word, for a different kind of a critical distance, and it creates another form of a safe space to reflect on those matters that might happen in public spaces. Do you think there is a difference in visibly queer art happening in the work you do, both in Hungary as opposed to abroad?
I think definitely, because I think the work currently being produced in Hungary is very self-reflective. It talks of the experience of being queer in Hungary, but also like the artists that are working now that we work with are the ones who are developing the scene. That makes it so more exciting, particularly for me, to be working with than an established scene in London, where it's dominated by highly represented artists who have had very long esteemed careers. So it's very hard for new artists to enter into the scene or to make a mark or into the Hungarian art market. So yeah, so there is a difference, because it's still DIY. It's almost kind of, yeah, it's DIY. It's from the grassroots. It's very collaborative. People want to help, not because they think these works might lead them to the big success, to the next institutional level show, but because they want to be there, they want to make something, and they want to, I suppose, help transform Budapest.
Exactly, but on the other hand, we, as for example for our Cologne, we really tried, whereas back in November last year when we had the first exhibition in Budapest, it was really a reflection of that time, people or artists having difficulties within their own societies. But for this Art Cologne opportunity, we wanted to bring artists who kind of create sort of that art that which could be understood from a European perspective as well. And also we think along this line that we brought artists that this kind of DIY and kind of community-based art is good quality at the same time. So it's a European level that they bring.
It's interesting that we spoke together today at your presentation, and you mentioned that there is a very important and very vibrant underground scene. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect and to think about the fact that you keep coming back to the bubbles that Claus mentioned, that those so-called safe spaces exist. Even if we tend to jump into the normative train and we tend to categorize everything so easily as this is what's happening in queer spaces in Hungary, period. And we kind of like do not do justice the multiplicity of those expressions. And you showed me a couple of prints and photographs that document that kind of a space. And you spoke of a very interesting, you used what was it? We were talking about, I forgot. It wasn't hosting. The fact that you use sometimes online websites for people to hook up, and that's a very interesting. Cruising is interesting. There was a very interesting pavilion at the Biennial from a Greek artist, Angelidakis, who also addresses the question of Greek spaces that are used as cruising spaces as a form of togetherness. Could you perhaps? I thought the work was fascinating. What you showed. Could you perhaps briefly talk about that cruising as a
Well, in Budapest particularly, there's a long history of bathhouses and thermal bathhouses. And if anyone knows the gay history of bathhouses, it's a very common space for cruising. So, yeah, so this particular artist, Abteiberg, he photographs the queer underground scene. And he found himself kind of disappointed with the queer scene that was in Hungary. So he went out and he developed his own. He started his own illegal raves in, like, I suppose, abandoned buildings or anywhere they could get access to, really. And it was to create a queer-friendly environment for him, for his friends, but also to, I suppose, bring a different style of clubbing to Hungary where they could be themselves, where if 2 men or 2 women suddenly found themselves in a corner doing whatever they were doing, then it was completely fine. So there is this tradition of cruising in Budapest. Like, there is everywhere, You just got to know where to look, and and it's whether you choose to want to see it.
Do you, Claus, think that there's something similar like that still exists today in, I don't know, Germany is a very, of course, liberal and open society, but at the same time, we still keep stumbling across the bubbles. It still relates to the spaces you decide to occupy, to the spaces and the peoples and the communities and the togetherness that happens that sometimes we decide to bring together. Do you think there are still, let's say in Cologne today, those kind of party spaces of open queerness?
Definitely. I exactly live like 100 meters from one of the biggest cruising areas in Cologne. And you see lots of toilet paper and tissues and whatever. So of course there is. And what's going missing a bit is like also in Frankfurt where I lived at in Cologne is like sort of the physicality of subcultural special scenes. So like dark rooms, or what you had in Cologne, and in Frankfurt you had the Stall, which was like the gritty dark human, and it was all, and when you were young it was frightening, and so on. So this physicality of this also first step into a queer world also is, I guess, now different because you have much more things happening online, which is another sort of safe zone. And I think also what you said, like to erect another kind of symbol of visibility, which is there, yeah, like you have the space, or you can go and accidentally meet someone, is super good, I think, because this is what I would. Because I'm old, I'm over 50, so I don't know, I don't have this like starting point at the moment. I don't know if I would look up on things on the internet. I would, I think, to find people, and if I would be in a country with a very repressive government, I would also try to sort of do that. But some things are also easier if they're just around the corner. So if you just can kind of drop there, and it's sort of a club or whatever, and you have more accidents happening, which makes like real queer underground, which are not only gay, I also want to mention that, but also lesbian, or like also like genderqueer. So there's much more than also like we talk a lot about the gay man, and it's for all the groups interesting, and I think it's kind of a thing to establish that a bit again. It's good for the vitality of accidents, of things that happen, not so pre-programmed. Like in the internet, you could say, I'm a gay, active, hairy, blah, blah, blah guy who's into fist fucking. So you can put that in, and then you find someone who's a passive, hairless guy who's into fist. Yes, then you have it. For me, that's a bit, it's very sexual now. If talking about identity, you can also say, I'm genderqueer, and I only want to meet people who are genderqueer. So, but then you have no one around you who's like lesbian or straight gay or whatever, or leather man. And I like the mixing. For me, it's in the mix. So, and this happens easier, I think, if you have a physical space where people just come in to have a beer.
At the same time, I think that we briefly mentioned it today when we talked that even if you enter those, let's say, diverse queer spaces, there is so often the case that there is still such a great deal of machismo and such a great deal of sexism as it relates strictly to, there's a spectrum of masculinity and femininity. The more you go to the feminine side, femme gays are not the same as macho gays. And women, female identifying individuals, trans women, always tend to be completely eradicated and left out from the discourse, which kind of like shows that it's so much more nuanced and complicated in all different fields. If it's a politically engaged, direct and honest art, even if it's a personal contemporary position, or it is a woman working in the art market with those kind of all complicated things that might not be so direct, but they are still there. How you find yourself as someone who has worked in a field that's highly competitive in the auction houses, that those kind of macho structures are still there, perhaps in the way the system works, perhaps in the way even as it might relate to structures or to the works shown. Do you find that kind of sexism so blatantly still there in a field that's so paradoxical? We see it so often that there is still so many, when you study art history, so many, the majority of the people are women, but the majority of people having leading positions in institutions are so often men, blatantly since straight men. Do you find that kind of sexism still there?
Oh, wow, this is complicated, yes. I think that not only... No, I have to start in a different way. Every human being is difficult. So I would not make any change if it's a queer person or homosexual or heterosexual. Persons are complicated. So in our field, working with colleagues, clients, everything, you have to be very careful while talking or acting with people. I agree. Should I wait?
I think the announcement this time is a little louder. so we can have an awkward break for a second until it goes by. And I'm blatantly staring at the people. Is it another minute? Okay. I mean, that's a little sexist. You were talking and then you were interrupted. I mean, no, okay. Now you can talk a little closer to the microphone.
Okay. Yes. Yes, but you are right. It's also in the working field of art historian, in museum and in auction houses. There are lots of women working there, but the main position are, or not always, but mainly are male or men working there. But this is changing. So we have a lot of museum directors which are female, and also in the auction houses, a lot of very high positions are female at the moment. So I think we are in the right direction to just make sure that the diversity is there.
And if you were to compare, for example, how those questions might be, if we get back, I think it's such an interesting fact that you're here, because it's an important contribution to those kind of political discussions, what the art market has to say. If you were to compare, for example, works that are shown on sale from, let's say, the classical modern period as opposed to contemporary positions, do you find a major difference as it might relate to gender expression? Works that come to auction that are older as opposed to ones that are newer, or do you think that that is in a sense not so important? If you compare, for example, a work from the 30s or a work from the late 19th century to a position from the 80s or the 90s.
You mean in the sales or in general? Okay, in the sales. So there are works from the 19th century also in the sales which clearly are related to gay artists, and they are showing mainly gay images. But it's not so visible then maybe in the contemporary art. So you have to know the iconography of the gay illustration to understand. And for example, I had a client who gave us a painting by Helmut von Hügel, who is also named Helmut Kolle, and it was showing a couple. And his parents bought it in the late 20s, and it was always hanging in the main bedroom of his mother and his father. And then his father and his mother died, and he brought us the painting. And then he told me, you can't imagine was what my father and my mother always told me. They always talked about this beautiful couple, woman and man. And he said they never realized that this was a painting of a gay couple. So this is the visibility and the selected perception you have or you don't have. And in the 19th century and also in the Renaissance, you have paintings like or works like this, but you have to see it. And I think in the modern time or in the contemporary time, it's much more visible. You see that this is a gay painting or made from a gay artist for a gay reception, for example, or a queer painting.
I think that misunderstanding is so amazing, that misrecognition, because it shows exactly how complex and nuanced those things are, and you can never think that it is one way or it is another way, because it's completely antithetical to what, let's say, so-called, even the term is in itself extremely problematic, but important to address, of queer art, because inherently you stumble across so many problems while trying to address it. Does it mean that every work of art created by artists identifying as queer counts as queer art? Is a heterosexual or a cis, in general, a cis person making art supposed to do, can they do queer art? It's such a complicated thing, and you can so easily get lost in, again, the normative and the bubble. So the pluralism of the things that makes it so hard to grasp, and at the same time, sometimes you have to be the politically engaged and honest and direct if the context asks for it, if the occasion is important. And do you guys mind telling us a little more about the specific positions that you're showing? There is she's sadly not joining us today. In the middle of the fair, there is a big boxing ring that was part of your presentation that was activated by a series of performances. Do you mind sharing with us a little bit what that was?
Yes, it's called the School of Disobedience, and their choreographer and contemporary dancer is Anna Adam, who sort of created this idea of School of Disobedience. And these are performance artists who mainly, like during the day, we've got the Right for Fight performances, which contains like 2 performance artists on stage performing in a kind of aggressive or seemingly masculine, violent moves, which really reflects on today's, obviously, of course, again, Hungarian heteronormativity, and this kind of masculine and feminine prejudice, which is very present in our country. This performance goes against these ideas, and during the evening sessions, we've got 40-minute performances. Those are different performances, but they mainly talk about the freedom of bodily expression as a woman, as a cis woman, as a transgender woman. So these performances, again, very inclusive of who is being queer or who's not, or who's LGBTQ or who is an ally, for example.
I think it's interesting that is activated in the context of an art fair. Have you seen any reactions to the work?
To the performances?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
From the audience.
Obviously. Everyone loves it, really, yeah.
Because it's interesting to see how people would approach it in that particular institutional context and how it's activated in that. It still boils down to what it means to occupy a space, and perhaps the same thing could be said for the monument you unveiled, Claus, in Düsseldorf. First of all, how did you feel when it was unveiled, and what were some of the reactions? And if there were some critical ones from, let's say, people who still might, sometimes there is a conservative argument being made, which is masked under the idea that we don't really need that because here everything is fine. Did you stumble across something like that?
We had very different reactions. I was, because we worked almost 2 years to realize this thing. And of course, after 2 years, you have a sort of a déformation professionnelle. You just like think, you want to get it through, it has to be finished, blah, blah, blah. So for me, the first revealing and the day after, we had Christopher Street Day in Düsseldorf. It was very touching because people came back in the world that was around this thing, and we had lots of elder people who said we waited for a monument to give visibility to these situations and to our living situations for so long, and it's so good that it's there. And I almost cried. There was kind of a 79-year-old lesbian couple, and they were coming and sitting and taking pictures of themselves. And because I was sort of already almost alienated from the process, I just came back emotionally, and I was like, wow, this is like this is good, because it really helps people gain energy and power. And the situation is not like in Hungary, but these people also went through a lot of shit. So this was nice. Then, of course, there were negative reactions, but not as much as I thought, because this time I expected negative reactions from all sides, because the monument itself has kind of a very historical, or even like East European look. It looks more like a working class fighting monument. And I thought this would, but actually it's accepted that this form of visibility is something to make people curious. That was the idea, to make people curious, what is this thing? And then come and you have a small plaque that says what it's all about, and then you think. So this was good, but of course we had this classical online troll things where people are like, what's this shit? So of course you have this, but I can't take that serious. But all in all, it was rather positive, and I was very afraid that we would have an aggressive outcome, because you see most of the queer monuments that you have in Germany had once, twice, or third or four times like a really aggressive destructions, but nothing yet, and I'm happy about that. And the other beautiful part is that the trick that sort of is used to make people curious works still. I have my spies who sits in the cafe next to the monument and tell me, and a lot of people who don't have any clue what this thing is come and have a look, because it's so out of time somehow, and then they read the text which says what it's all about, and then you have mostly positive reactions. So you have really families, cis families, where then the children also pose in front, and so this kind of sneaks, like a Trojan horse, sneaks into like a broader community, which was my idea. So I hope this still will work in further years. So it was also more positive, but one thing that was difficult was that people who wanted to criticize it hardly said, we can't even criticize it because it's queer, and you can't criticize a queer thing. So that was also like, you have this like, yeah, we are safe here because it's queer, and it's you can't criticize that. But I think of course you can. And I'm not made of sugar, so of course it could be but yeah, I think these are people who love to these negative Nancy's, I don't know. So these people, yeah, are always everywhere, whatever you do. If you put a square there, they hate the square. If you put a table there, they hate the table. If you put 4 figures there, they hate the 4 figures. Whatever you do, they hate it. So this will happen anyway. But all in all, it was good. And the most important part that it was really taken positively by the community. And this is for me the two things: to reach the community and reach people who are more or less curious and want to see what's happening. Both worked good.
And perhaps we have 3 minutes. And before we close, I would just briefly like to hear from you guys just a quick statement, that's a weird word, just a quick thoughts of when something like that in public spaces happens in the work you guys do. How do you tend to see the reaction, let's say, from the different bubbles? Because one tends to think that very wrong, cliché, normative way, oh, everyone is going to hate it, we're going to get punched because no one likes us. But it's so surprising in so many different ways, and we still have a lot to learn from this context. Do you guys have a brief story for 2 minutes?
No, you go first.
No.
Sorry, what was the question?
2 minutes. I mean, it's a quick question. If some kind of a visibly queer thing happens as an action that you guys work on in public spaces, how are the reactions in general? If we pick up what Claus described, from the broader public.
I think generally positive. Like the last exhibition we did in 2020 was generally positive, which was a good thing. But it's impossible to ignore that it might not always be positive. But we tend to get our work noticed more abroad than we do than in Hungary. But from the public, we've largely had a very positive response. Like people, mainly because we're in Budapest, in the countryside it might be different. But I would say it's been a positive response from the actions that we're doing, and from, I suppose, from what the artists are doing, really. We're just facilitating and allowing and giving them a space to be seen.
Thank you. We are 1 minute, and I think thank you so much for the discussion. It's quite interesting to reflect on those questions, but specifically if we want to summarize and wrap up what we talked about today of the nuanced way that a queer expression might enter the logic of a work. It might end up not being, the driven factor. It might end up being an engaged political thing. It might end up just being in the background because it has to be in the forefront because it has to be, and it has to be addressed from an institutional standpoint because it has to be. And what makes it fascinating and at the same time hard is exactly the nuance and the bubbles that you said. I think bubbles is a very important thing. The fear of not falling into the normative, and I think that's quite important. And I think we are done. And thank you so much for talking today, and enjoy the rest of your stay in Cologne. Thank you.